The courtroom was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that made every noise, every breath, feel amplified. The gallery filled with spectators, reporters, and even a few lawmakers, all sat waiting with bated breath. It wasn't just any trial. It was a case that had drawn national attention, with a battle over legal rights and corporate power. But it wasn't just the case itself that had everyone on edge. It was the man at the center of it all, the billionaire who had built his empire on arrogance and defiance. Markham Steele. A name that was both feared and admired. His reputation was as sharp as the suits he wore, as cold as the glass towers he owned. He was used to getting his way, bending the rules to fit his narrative, and crushing anyone who dared to stand against him. He thought the world bent to his will. That was until today. As the judge entered the courtroom, the tension seemed to thicken in the air. Judge Alexandria Harris was known for her fairness, her integrity, and her unflinching commitment to justice. She was no stranger to difficult cases, but this one was different. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about something deeper. Something more personal. The moment she stepped up to the bench, Markham Steele's eyes locked onto her. The room, though packed, seemed to vanish. For a fleeting moment, there was only the two of them. Steele, sitting with his usual air of smug confidence, and Harris, standing tall and commanding, a symbol of both strength and grace. And then, it happened. Markham Steele, without any visible hesitation, refused to stand. The murmurs in the room began almost immediately. It wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a statement. A defiant challenge. His actions were deliberate. His refusal was not just about showing disrespect to the court. It was a blatant insult to the black judge standing before him. In that moment, Steele made it clear that he considered himself above any rules, any authority, even the law itself. Judge Harris stood motionless, her face calm, but the weight of the situation was evident. Her hand briefly touched the side of the bench, as if grounding herself, but her posture didn't waver. It was clear, she wasn't going to let this moment pass without addressing it. And yet, no one in the room knew what would happen next. Everyone waited in complete silence, as if time itself had slowed. Steele's arrogance was palpable. He smiled, almost smugly, as he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the judge, daring her to respond. It was a calculated move. He knew that challenging a judge in such a public way could cause a scandal, but he didn't care. To him, the system was something to be manipulated, not respected. To him, power was something you took, by force, by intimidation, by whatever means necessary. But Judge Harris wasn't someone who could be intimidated. She inhaled deeply, her eyes scanning the room. It wasn't just the billionaire's defiance that made this moment significant, it was the fact that she knew this was bigger than any individual. It wasn't just about her or him. It was about everything the courtroom represented. Justice. Equality. The fight for what was right. She took her seat at the bench. It wasn't a move of submission, but one of control. She was in charge here. Not him. Mr. Steele, she began, her voice steady and unyielding. I would remind you that this court operates under the principles of respect for the law and for all those present within it. Your refusal to stand is a direct affront to the dignity of this court. A few gasps rippled through the gallery. Markham Steele's lips curled into a sneer, but the judge continued. I will not tolerate such behavior. And I will not allow this trial to be derailed by your blatant disrespect. For a brief moment, Steele's expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by that same arrogance. I'm simply stating my position, he said, his voice smooth but dripping with contempt. Respect is earned, Your Honor. It isn't given. The audacity of his words hung in the air, and for a second, it felt as if the room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. What would Judge Harris do? Would she back down, or would she stand her ground? Judge Harris's gaze never wavered. She was no stranger to challenges, especially those laced with racial undertones. She had fought battles her entire life, not just in the courtroom, but in a world that had often tried to keep her down simply because of the color of her skin. But she had never let that define her. She had always been more than just a symbol. She had been a force. A force for fairness, for justice, and for truth. "No, Mr. Steele," she said firmly. "Respect is not something you take. It is something you give. And in this courtroom, you will respect the law, the process, and the people within it, whether you choose to or not." The tension in the room was palpable. A moment of silence stretched between them. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for the next move. Judge Harris remained composed, unshaken by Steele's defiance. And then, with a simple gesture, she did something no one expected. She stood. Not out of anger or frustration, but out of sheer, unyielding resolve. Her stance was deliberate, a message that this moment, this act of disrespect, would not go unnoticed. She didn't need to shout, to make a spectacle of herself. She just needed to stand tall, to show that she wouldn't allow anyone to undermine the very principles she had spent her life fighting for. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time, there was a crack in his confident facade. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he glanced nervously at his legal team. They knew this wasn't going to be easy. He had underestimated Judge Harris, and now he was realizing that. The judge's gaze swept over the room, locking eyes with each person who dared to meet her stare. And for the first time in a long time, those who were watching began to realize something. This wasn't just about a courtroom battle. This was about a larger struggle. A fight for dignity. A fight for respect. And in that moment, Judge Alexandria Harris had made it clear that she would not back down. Her words, calm and clear, rang through the courtroom. "If you refuse to stand for justice," she said, "then you will stand for nothing at all." The crowd shifted. Whispers started to grow louder, and the weight of what had just transpired hung over everyone. Markham Steele sat there, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with frustration. But he didn't speak. He didn't dare challenge her again. Not yet. Judge Harris nodded to the bailiff, signaling that they would proceed. The courtroom slowly came back to life, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Something had changed. The balance of power, the expectation of control, it had all tilted. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a public reckoning. Outside, the media quickly picked up on the story. The headlines ran wild: "Billionaire disrespects Black Judge, what happens next will shock you." It wasn't just a legal issue anymore. It was a cultural moment. A moment that would resonate far beyond the confines of the courtroom. As the trial continued, the people watching, both inside and outside the courtroom, knew one thing for certain: the events of this day would echo through history. Judge Alexandria Harris had taken a stand. A stand that would shape the course of this trial, and the way people viewed power and respect, for years to come. And this was only the beginning. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom as Judge Alexandria Harris took her seat again. The tension in the air was thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Markham Steele sat motionless, but his eyes were fixed on the judge, a storm of emotions flashing in them. He had underestimated her, mistaken her calm demeanor for weakness. Now, he was beginning to realize that he was up against something far more powerful than his arrogance. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, reporters scribbling notes, and spectators exchanging whispered comments. Outside, the media had already spun the event into a frenzy. It was no longer just a legal battle between two parties, it had become a cultural battleground, with everyone scrambling to figure out what it meant. Judge Harris had made her statement, and it resonated deeply, far beyond the courtroom doors. The fight was no longer just about the law. It was about dignity, respect, and power. And in this moment, the stakes had become personal for everyone involved. Markham Steele shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of the table nervously. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a simmering anger he couldn't quite control. The room felt suffocating now, as though the weight of his own pride was pulling him down. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. Now, the tables had turned. Alexandria Harris, though, didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledging the storm brewing in his mind. She was calm, focused, resolute. The room had quieted down, the eyes of everyone now trained on her. This was her courtroom. And she would not let it be hijacked by someone who thought he could bulldoze his way through life. "Mr. Steele," Judge Harris said, her voice breaking the silence, "I hope that you understand the seriousness of your actions today." Steele's jaw tightened as he met her gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, only the barest hint of defiance. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor. I made my position clear," he said, his voice low, yet dripping with contempt. "I don't answer to anyone. Not you. Not anyone in this room." The room was silent again. Judge Harris didn't flinch. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Steele. You do answer to the law. You answer to the people in this courtroom. You answer to the idea that justice is blind, no one is above it." He scoffed, shifting in his chair once more. "You think that because you wear that robe, you have the power to control me? To tell me what to do?" His voice was louder now, rising in anger. The bravado in his words couldn't hide the nervous edge. He was used to bending the world around him. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he could bend her. "I'm not here to control you, Mr. Steele," Judge Harris replied, her tone soft but firm. "I'm here to remind you of what you seem to have forgotten, what everyone else in this room needs to remember. That no one is above the law. Not you. Not me. Not anyone." A tense silence followed her words. Steele's smirk faltered. His lawyer, seated beside him, leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Steele didn't acknowledge it. His eyes were still locked on Judge Harris, though now there was something more calculating in his gaze. A plan was forming, and he knew it had to be perfect. He had to get back control of the room, and he would do whatever it took to make that happen. "I came here to win, Your Honor," Steele said, his voice dripping with menace. "And I will. It doesn't matter how this courtroom is run. It doesn't matter how many moral lessons you want to teach. When this trial is over, I will have what I came for." Judge Harris remained unshaken. She knew Steele had been playing this game for years. He was the kind of man who saw people as pawns, and power as the ultimate goal. She had seen men like him before, those who thought their money could buy them anything, including immunity from consequences. But Alexandria wasn't afraid of him. She had fought bigger battles in her life. And today, she would stand her ground. "You will win nothing if you continue on this path, Mr. Steele," she said, her eyes piercing his. "Because if you continue to disrespect this court, I will hold you in contempt. And that, no amount of money will fix." The sharp words hung in the air like a challenge. Steele's face flushed a deep shade of red. He had always been in control, always been the one to dictate the terms. But now, in front of everyone in this room, and millions more watching outside, his power felt fragile. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, trying to regain composure. "Very well, Your Honor. You've made your point." But there was no humility in his voice, only the promise of revenge. Steele wasn't used to losing, and he wouldn't let this moment of humiliation slide easily. He would find a way to bend the rules back in his favor. He had too much to lose. Judge Harris didn't give him another glance. She nodded to the bailiff, signaling for the court to proceed. The trial was set to continue, but the weight of the events that had just unfolded was far from over. As the trial continued, the ripple effect of Steele's actions became more apparent. The courtroom was divided. Many felt the sting of his disrespect toward the judge, but there were others, those loyal to Steele, who quietly supported him, whispering among themselves that Harris had gone too far in confronting the billionaire. It wasn't just a matter of legal strategy anymore. It was a personal attack on someone who had spent years building his empire. And for some, that was unforgivable. The media frenzy outside continued to build. Reporters huddled outside the courthouse, feeding the public a steady stream of information, real or imagined, about what had transpired in the courtroom. Social media platforms exploded with opinions, hashtags trending in favor of both sides. Hashtag respect for Harris and hashtag Steele is right began to dominate conversations, as people passionately debated who was in the right. But inside the courtroom, Judge Harris remained focused on the trial. Her mind was sharp, her decisions deliberate. She had to remind herself, again and again, that this was about more than just one man's disrespect. This was about setting a precedent, making sure that the next person who walked into her courtroom would know that there would be consequences for arrogance, for injustice. She was not just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of being overlooked, dismissed, or ignored. Steele, however, was not about to back down. He was plotting his next move. He had the resources, the power, and the influence to turn this situation around. His lawyers had already begun to prepare a strategy, one that involved questioning the legitimacy of Harris's authority and attacking her professional conduct. He had the ability to sway public opinion and manipulate the situation to his advantage. And he wasn't afraid to use every weapon at his disposal. But what Steele didn't anticipate was that Alexandria Harris wasn't just going to stand there. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let him use his wealth and influence to escape the consequences of his actions. Over the next few days, the trial would take unexpected turns. Witnesses would testify. Evidence would be presented. And Steele would soon realize that he had underestimated the power of a woman who refused to be silenced, who refused to let him, or anyone else, get away with disrespecting the very system they were all supposed to uphold. The courtroom was alive with energy the moment the gavel struck. The trial had taken on a new tone, a tone that had little to do with legal arguments and everything to do with the personal clash between Markham Steele and Judge Alexandria Harris. The tension in the room could be cut with a knife, every word from Steele's legal team weighed carefully, every decision from Harris calculated. This wasn't just a fight over the law anymore. This was a fight over respect. Over who could control the narrative. Over who could claim the final victory. Steele was furious. He had been trying to bend the world to his will for years, and in one moment, Harris had reminded him that even the mighty could be humbled. His empire, built on billions, seemed so fragile now in the face of her defiance. He had always believed that his wealth could buy anything: power, influence, silence. But Alexandria Harris wasn't for sale. And the more she stood her ground, the more Steele realized that he had underestimated her completely. Steele sat in the defense seat, his mind racing. The whispers of his supporters in the courtroom didn't soothe him, instead, they fed into his growing resentment. There was one thing Steele could never stand: being made to look weak. And this woman had managed to do just that, humiliate him in front of the world. She wasn't just a judge, she was a symbol of something he despised. Equality. Justice. The idea that no one was above the law. And in his eyes, that was a threat. His legal team had been working overtime since the incident, drafting motions, planning their next steps. They were preparing to challenge Harris's authority, to discredit her actions. But Steele knew it wasn't just about the law anymore. He needed something more. He needed to change the narrative, to make sure the public saw him as the victim, not the villain. Meanwhile, Judge Harris had spent every moment since that first confrontation analyzing her own position. She knew the weight of what she had done. She had defied a billionaire in a courtroom, a man whose influence reached far beyond the walls of this building. But for her, it wasn't about playing a game of power, it was about standing up for what was right. She had fought against inequality all her life. Her fight in this courtroom was just another battle in the long war against injustice. She couldn't back down now. Not when so much was at stake. Not when her integrity had been called into question. The morning of the next hearing, Alexandria walked into the courtroom with a sense of determination. She had always been confident in her decisions, but this time, it felt different. The pressure was immense. The eyes of the world were upon her, and she knew it. Her every word, every decision would be scrutinized. And yet, she was resolute. Her gavel struck the wood, and the room fell silent, waiting for her instructions. "I trust we are all prepared to proceed," Judge Harris said, her voice carrying authority. She turned her gaze to Steele, who was seated with his legal team, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Steele, I assume you've come to present your case today?" Steele's lawyer, a seasoned litigator named Robert King, stood up first, his posture tense. He was no rookie. King had represented some of the most powerful figures in the country, and he had an aura of control about him. His reputation as a master manipulator of the law was well known. But even he couldn't hide the strain in his voice as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor," King began, "we request that the court consider the bias displayed in your conduct during the last session. We believe that your actions have compromised the fairness of these proceedings, and we ask that you recuse yourself from this trial." The courtroom held its collective breath. The words, "recuse yourself," hung in the air, like a loaded gun waiting to fire. Alexandria Harris remained calm, her eyes fixed on King. She had expected this move, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. If she allowed herself to show any sign of weakness, even for a moment, Steele would win. The narrative would shift, and she would become the villain. "I see," Judge Harris said, her voice unwavering. "And on what grounds do you base this request, Mr. King?" King glanced at Steele, who gave a slight nod, his jaw clenched tightly. King cleared his throat and continued. "It is clear that Judge Harris has allowed personal bias to influence her judgment. Her actions in this courtroom, particularly her public confrontation with Mr. Steele, have shown a disregard for the impartiality required of this court. We believe that her continued involvement would jeopardize the integrity of the trial." The room was tense. Steele's supporters in the courtroom shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. They had anticipated this move, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. The challenge was on, and Alexandria knew she couldn't let it stand. "I will not recuse myself," Judge Harris said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "My actions were not out of bias. They were out of necessity. This courtroom will run according to the law, and if you cannot abide by that, then I suggest you take your arguments elsewhere." King's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. Instead, he sat down, signaling the end of the exchange. He knew the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But Harris wasn't done. She had made her point, but she knew that Steele and his team were not going to back down so easily. They were playing a game of reputation now, and in that game, they had the advantage. But Alexandria had something they didn't, a deep sense of duty to the law and the people she served. And in this moment, that meant everything. As the trial continued, it became clear that Steele wasn't just fighting for a verdict. He was fighting for his image. His brand. His power. He was used to controlling every aspect of his life, but now, his reputation was on the line. If he couldn't win this trial, the scandal that would follow could ruin him. Alexandria knew this. And she knew that Steele would stop at nothing to protect himself. His attacks on her wouldn't be limited to legal challenges. They would extend into the court of public opinion. He would twist the narrative, turn the public against her, and do everything in his power to make her look like the villain. She had already seen how far he was willing to go. But the question was, how far was she willing to go to stop him? The trial's media circus intensified as the days passed. Journalists from all corners of the country descended upon the courthouse, eager for any hint of drama. News outlets began running stories about Steele's so-called war with the courts, painting him as the victim of a biased system. At the same time, Alexandria Harris's image was being smeared. Her critics, many of whom had been silent in the past, now came out of the woodwork. They claimed she was unfit to serve as a judge, that she was too emotional, too personal in her approach. But Alexandria didn't flinch. She stood strong in the face of it all. She knew the truth. She knew what was right. And as long as she was in that courtroom, she would stand for the people who trusted the legal system to protect them, even if it meant going head-to-head with one of the most powerful men in the country. The final moments of the trial were closing in, and both sides were preparing for their last big moves. Steele's team had mounted a full-scale attack on Harris's credibility. They had enlisted the help of powerful allies, public figures, lobbyists, and influencers, who began to speak out, publicly supporting Steele and condemning Harris's overreach in the courtroom. Alexandria was not naive enough to believe this would not affect her. But she was determined to finish what she started. The court's final verdict was coming soon. And when the gavel fell, it would be more than just a decision, it would be a statement. A statement about power, about integrity, and about the future of the law itself. The days had dragged on, and the trial had taken a toll on everyone involved. The courtroom felt like a battleground now, the constant tension crackling in the air. For Markham Steele. Each day in the courthouse seemed to strip away more of the power he had spent his life building. His usual poise was beginning to slip, and the cracks in his carefully curated persona were becoming more apparent. But he wasn't going to give up. Not now, not when everything he had worked for was hanging in the balance. Judge Alexandria Harris, on the other hand, stood resolute. Every argument, every personal attack against her had only strengthened her resolve. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, but the weight of public opinion no longer mattered. She knew what she had to do. She had come this far because of a deep belief in the integrity of the law, and she wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, distract her from her duty. The courtroom had been filled with reporters and spectators for days, but today, it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of impending resolution. The final arguments were about to be made, and everyone knew that once the gavel fell, everything would change. Markham Steele sat in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had grown impatient with the proceedings, feeling the walls close in around him. His reputation was at stake, and he wasn't going to let Judge Harris stand in the way of his victory. His legal team had prepared a final, aggressive strategy to try and salvage what little remained of his image. They had called in high-profile figures to testify, all to bolster his claims that he was the victim of a personal vendetta. But Steele's plans were already beginning to unravel. He looked up as Alexandria Harris entered the courtroom, her calm presence cutting through the tension. She didn't seem fazed by the storm of media surrounding the trial. Her posture remained straight, her gaze unwavering. Steele couldn't help but feel a surge of irritation. She was too composed, too sure of herself. She knew the stakes, and she was ready for whatever came next. "I trust we're ready to proceed, Mr. Steele." Harris's voice rang out, clear and commanding. Steele didn't respond immediately. His lips tightened into a thin line as he glanced at his attorney, Robert King. The man had been a steady force throughout the trial, but even King's confidence seemed to be faltering now. Steele had a feeling that the odds were no longer in his favor. But he wasn't going to admit defeat. "We're ready, Your Honor," King finally said, standing up to address the court. "But before we proceed with the closing arguments, we request that you step down from this case." The words landed like a bomb in the courtroom. Judge Harris didn't flinch. She had known this was coming. Steele's legal team had been playing this card for weeks, but she wasn't backing down now. "I see," Judge Harris said, her tone even. "And what is the basis for this request, Mr. King?" King's voice was steady, though there was a sharp edge to it. "Your Honor, your conduct throughout this trial has made it clear that you have a personal bias against my client. Your actions have been an affront to the dignity of this courtroom. We believe that the only fair course of action is for you to recuse yourself from this case immediately." The room was still, the tension palpable. Steele's supporters in the gallery murmured quietly to one another, but no one dared speak too loudly. The atmosphere was charged, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for Harris's response. Judge Harris paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the courtroom. Then, in a voice that carried an undeniable authority, she spoke. "I will not recuse myself," she said firmly. "I have acted in accordance with the law and with the highest standards of this court. I will not allow personal attacks or public pressure to influence my decisions. This trial will continue, and it will conclude according to the rule of law." Steele's jaw clenched, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt in his own certainty. He had expected her to fold, to retreat in the face of his relentless pressure. But Alexandria Harris wasn't the type of person to back down. And that made her even more dangerous in his eyes. "I find your objections misplaced," Harris continued, her gaze fixed on King. "If you have no further motions, we will proceed with the closing arguments. I expect both sides to be brief. We are at the final stages, and I will not tolerate any more distractions." Steele's team exchanged uneasy glances. They knew they had lost the battle for her recusal, but the war wasn't over. The final arguments would determine everything. The courtroom grew quiet as the attorneys prepared for their closing statements. Alexandria Harris sat at the bench, her mind sharp, every move calculated. She had been through countless cases, but this one was different. It wasn't just about the facts or the law, it was about the heart of the legal system itself. And in this moment, she was the one standing between truth and a carefully constructed lie. Markham Steele's final argument was just as grandiose as expected. His lawyer, King, took the floor, his voice booming as he painted Steele as a victim of a biased judicial system, one that was out to destroy him for reasons beyond the trial. He spoke of Harris's alleged vendetta, her supposed personal motivations, and how the entire case had been marred by her unprofessionalism. "There is no doubt in our minds," King said, "that the actions of Judge Alexandria Harris have been deliberately aimed at tarnishing Mr. Steele's name and reputation. This trial has ceased to be about justice, it has become a personal crusade against a man who has done nothing but try to protect his legacy." Harris's eyes narrowed as she listened to the words. She had prepared herself for this moment, but it still stung. It was one thing to fight for the law, but another to have your character and integrity attacked in such a public manner. She knew that no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much evidence she presented, Steele's narrative would likely dominate the media. It would be his word against hers. But Alexandria didn't hesitate. She would not let the lies stand. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, her gaze sweeping across the room. Her voice was steady, but her words cut deep. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Harris began, "this case has never been about personal grudges or petty power struggles. It has always been about one thing, justice. The law is not here to serve the powerful or the wealthy. It is here to serve the people. And in this case, we are faced with a man who believes that his wealth and influence entitle him to bend the system to his will. Markham Steele has used every tool at his disposal to try to manipulate the outcome of this trial. But the law is not for sale." There was a brief pause as her words echoed in the silence of the courtroom. "I will not stand by and allow one man's arrogance to dictate the future of this case," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I will not recuse myself. I will not be intimidated. And I will not let the truth be buried under a mountain of lies." The impact of her words was immediate. Steele's supporters looked uncomfortable, some even shifting in their seats. There was a growing sense of unease in the courtroom, but no one dared speak out. Harris had made her stand clear. She was no longer just a judge, she was a force to be reckoned with. The room remained tense as both sides rested their cases. It was clear that the final verdict would be a monumental one, and no one knew how it would go. Alexandria Harris was unyielding in her resolve, but Markham Steele was more determined than ever to win. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was thick with anticipation as the final day of the trial arrived. The air felt heavier than it ever had before, charged with the electricity of 100 unseen tensions. Markham Steele sat at his table, staring blankly at the front of the room, his jaw clenched tight. His legal team had worked tirelessly for days to spin a narrative, one that portrayed him as the victim of a corrupt system. But it hadn't worked. Judge Alexandria Harris had been too strong, too unwavering, and now, the endgame was in sight. Steele knew the truth, he had a hard time accepting it, but it was undeniable. His empire was crumbling. His reputation, his legacy, everything he had built seemed to be slipping from his grasp. The very thing that had been his strength for so many years, his arrogance, was now his greatest weakness. Across the courtroom, Judge Harris sat like a rock, her face composed, her eyes sharp as ever. She had no intention of backing down. The trial had become more than just a legal matter, it had turned into a moral test. It had become a test of character for both of them. And she had no plans of losing. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters, and supporters from both sides. The media frenzy surrounding the case had only grown with every twist and turn, and today, the final moments would play out in front of an audience more eager than ever to see how it all ended. The room seemed to hold its breath as Harris raised her gavel, signaling the start of the final phase. "Let the closing statements begin," she announced, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Steele's legal team took the floor first, their final words hanging in the air with a dangerous mixture of certainty and defiance. They had one last chance to shift the narrative in their favor, and they were going to use every trick in the book. Robert King, Steele's lead attorney, stood tall, his voice booming with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," King began, his tone smooth and persuasive, "the facts of this case are clear. Markham Steele is a man who has built his success from the ground up. He has dedicated his life to his company, to his family, to this country. And what has he received in return? Personal attacks, unfounded accusations, and a biased judicial system that seeks nothing less than to destroy him. This trial has ceased to be about justice. It has become a crusade. A crusade to ruin a man who dared to stand up for his principles. What happened here in this courtroom is not justice, it is revenge." King's words echoed through the room, and for a moment, even Harris felt a flicker of doubt. Steele's team had played their cards well, and they had painted a picture of a man who had been wronged, of a man who was being crushed under the weight of a system that didn't understand his struggles. But Harris wasn't about to let this lie stand. As King finished, the gallery was abuzz with whispers. It was the moment they had all been waiting for, the final confrontation. Judge Harris stood, her presence commanding immediate attention. The entire room fell into complete silence as she began her rebuttal. She didn't need to raise her voice to make herself heard. Her calm demeanor and unwavering gaze were enough. "Mr. King," Harris began, her voice cool and measured, "what you fail to understand, and what I hope you will come to accept, is that justice does not bow to wealth or power. It does not yield to influence. It cannot be bought. And it will not be manipulated by those who think themselves above the law." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "For weeks, I have sat here and watched as Mr. Steele and his legal team attempted to distort the truth, to turn this case into something it is not. The facts are not up for debate. They are clear. Mr. Steele is guilty of what he stands accused of. This trial has never been about revenge, it has always been about the pursuit of justice for the victim. And it will remain so until the final gavel falls." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Steele's supporters bristled, and murmurs broke out in the crowd. It was clear that Harris's words had struck a chord. She had cut through the web of deception Steele's team had so carefully spun. But Steele wasn't done yet. He had one more move to make, one last play to try and turn the tide in his favor. He stood up suddenly, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and desperation. He had been silent during the entire trial, relying on his lawyers to do the talking, but now, he felt it was his moment. He had to speak up. He had to try and salvage everything. "Your Honor," Steele said, his voice trembling but defiant, "this whole trial is a farce. You, of all people, should understand the pressure I've been under. I have worked my entire life to build what I have, to create something that will last. And yet, here I am, on the verge of losing it all because of a personal vendetta. This trial isn't about the truth. It's about destroying me, about taking away everything I've worked for. You've let this case go far beyond the courtroom. You've let your personal feelings interfere with your judgment." There was a pause, and the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. For a moment, it seemed like Steele might win this battle of words. But then, Harris did something unexpected. She didn't lash out. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I understand pressure, Mr. Steele," she said quietly. "But what you fail to understand is that the law is not a tool for the powerful to wield. It is a shield for the powerless, a mechanism for ensuring fairness. If you cannot accept that, then perhaps you are the one who needs to reconsider your place in this courtroom." The crowd was stunned into silence. Steele's eyes widened in disbelief as his carefully constructed defense began to crumble before him. The truth was that there was no way out now. He had pushed too far, and now he was facing the consequences. Later that day, the verdict. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours. In the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. No one moved, no one spoke. The tension was unbearable. Markham Steele sat, his face a mask of frustration and anxiety, while Judge Harris remained calm, her eyes fixed on the door. She knew the jury would soon return with their decision. Finally, the door opened, and the jury foreman walked into the room, his face grave. "Your Honor," he said, "we have reached a verdict." The room fell completely still as the foreman approached the bench, the tension in the air palpable. The foreman handed the paper to Harris, who unfolded it with a steady hand. Steele's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the judge, waiting for the words that would seal his fate. Judge Harris cleared her throat and spoke the words that would change everything. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Markham Steele, guilty of the charges brought against him." The verdict hit Steele like a sledgehammer. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. He couldn't process what he was hearing. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had done everything right, he had fought tooth and nail, manipulated the narrative, and used every ounce of his power to avoid this. But now, standing in front of him, was the stark reality: he was going to lose everything. As the verdict was read, Steele's supporters in the gallery erupted in outrage, but Harris remained composed, her expression unreadable. She had done her job. And now, justice had been served. The air in the courtroom was still thick with tension as the final moments of the trial approached. It had been a journey full of twists, drama, and the kind of suspense that kept everyone on the edge of their seats. Markham Steele had done everything in his power to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. But now, there was no escape. The verdict had been delivered, and the weight of the jury's decision hung over him like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Markham Steele sat in his seat, his knuckles white from gripping the arms of the chair. His eyes were fixed on Judge Alexandria Harris, who sat at the bench, her gaze unwavering. She had been resolute throughout the trial, never once wavering in her commitment to the truth. Now, as the final phase of the trial began, Steele could see the inevitable approaching. There was no more room for manipulation, no more games to play. The time for evasion was over. The courtroom was a battlefield, and Steele was no longer the one in control. Judge Harris stood, her voice cutting through the silence that had descended on the room. The jury has spoken, and the verdict is clear. Markham Steele has been found guilty. Now, the time has come to determine his sentence. We will proceed with the sentencing hearing. The words echoed in Steele's ears, each syllable a reminder that his empire was falling apart. He had spent his life building wealth and power, manipulating people and systems to his advantage. But all of that meant nothing now. The law had caught up with him, and for the first time in his life, Steele felt the weight of his actions. I would like to hear from the defense, Judge Harris continued, her tone firm but fair. If there is anything you wish to present before we proceed with sentencing. Robert King, Steele's lead attorney, stood up, his face a mask of determination. Your Honor, we ask that you consider the impact this trial has had on Mr. Steele's life. He is a man who has contributed greatly to society, who has created jobs and provided opportunities for thousands of people. We believe his actions, while wrong, were motivated by a desire to protect what he built, to ensure the future of his company and his family. We ask that you show leniency in your sentencing. Harris listened carefully, her expression neutral as King continued. Mr. Steele has been under immense pressure, and his actions were clouded by his need to protect everything he has worked for. We ask that you consider his good character, his past contributions, and his remorse for the mistakes he has made. Steele's eyes were fixed on Harris, waiting for her response. He knew this was his last chance, the last opportunity to salvage something from this disaster. But he also knew it was a long shot. Harris wasn't one to be swayed by pleas or sentimental arguments. She had already made up her mind. She had seen through the charade, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Judge Harris turned her gaze to Steele, her eyes piercing. Mr. Steele, she said, her voice calm yet resolute, I have listened to the defense's arguments. I have heard the claims of remorse, the appeals for leniency. But let me make one thing clear, the law is not about sympathy. It is not about past achievements or future potential. It is about justice. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. You have had the privilege of living a life of power and influence. You have used that privilege to manipulate others, to protect yourself at all costs. And now, the consequences of your actions are here. The law does not care about your wealth, your reputation, or your influence. It only cares about what is right. The room was completely still as Judge Harris continued. Markham Steele, you have been found guilty of serious offenses. Your actions have caused harm to countless individuals, and your refusal to accept responsibility for your choices has only made matters worse. Therefore, I have no choice but to impose a sentence that reflects the severity of your crimes. Steele's heart pounded in his chest as he sat motionless, his mind racing. He had spent so long building his empire, using every tool at his disposal to maintain control. But now, it seemed like all of that was slipping away. The walls were closing in, and he was trapped. Judge Harris paused once more, her eyes never leaving Steele. The sentence is as follows, she began, her voice steady but firm. Markham Steele, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for your involvement in the crimes for which you have been convicted. Additionally, you will be required to pay restitution to the victims of your actions, as well as any fines imposed by this court. The words felt like a hammer striking Steele's chest. 10 years. His world, his empire, everything he had worked for, it was all crumbling before his eyes. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Take him into custody, Judge Harris ordered. 2 officers approached Steele, their eyes hard as they moved toward him. For a moment, Steele couldn't move. He was frozen in place, unable to believe what was happening. But then, slowly, the reality set in. His empire was gone. His wealth, his influence, all of it was meaningless now. He was just another man, a man who had fallen from grace. As the officers placed him in handcuffs and led him away, the courtroom remained silent. The spectators were still, processing the gravity of the moment. Markham Steele, once a titan of industry, was now nothing more than a convicted criminal. Outside the courtroom, the world had already begun to move on. The media frenzy that had surrounded the trial had shifted to other stories, other controversies. But for Markham Steele, the consequences of his actions were just beginning. His life, his legacy, was forever altered. There would be no redemption, no second chance. He had lost everything. The aftermath, a lesson learned. It was months later when the full weight of Steele's fall from grace truly began to sink in. He sat alone in his prison cell, his thoughts dark and brooding. The world he had once controlled had vanished. His wealth, his power, his reputation, none of it mattered now. He was just another man in a prison cell, serving time for his crimes. He had spent so many years focused on building his empire, on creating something that would last, that he had neglected the most important thing, the people around him. He had ignored the cost of his actions, the lives he had ruined along the way. And now, as he sat in the quiet darkness of his cell, he realized the harsh truth. No amount of money or power could ever replace the human connections he had sacrificed. Markham Steele had always believed that he was above the law, that he could do whatever it took to protect his empire. But in the end, it was the law that had brought him down. It was the truth that had shattered his world, piece by piece. And yet, as the months passed, a small part of him began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he started to understand the lesson that had been forced upon him. The lesson that was the very foundation of what Judge Harris had stood for: true power did not lie in wealth or influence. It lay in the strength of character, in the ability to take responsibility for one's actions, and in the willingness to face the consequences without evasion. Markham Steele had lost everything, but in that loss, he had found something more valuable than money or power. He had found humility. He had found the courage to face his own flaws and to accept that, in the end, he was no different from anyone else. And that, he realized, was the true lesson of his downfall. The law was not a tool for the powerful to wield, it was a shield for the powerless, a force that could not be manipulated, no matter how much money or influence one had. The truth always came to light, and in the end, it was the truth that had set him on the path to redemption.